Listening, squirrels. My hat turned around. Don't need the bill, sun ain't in my eyes now. I forgot to show these on live today. These are the seconds of the Aries. They had Aries and I forgot what the other was. But anyway, when they bring on the seconds, Virgo, I think it was. I don't think I got any of those. But I think the seconds are just as pretty, if not prettier, than the other ones. And you can get the ones that are off just a little in the size, or the size, wrong size might be stamped on it. I forget which it is. But anyway, I reckon this one was a reject or a second because it doesn't have the swirls up here. It's just kind of see-through. But I like that. And I think it's pretty everywhere. And that's the J one. And then I got no, that's an L. So, in Furl's Land, an L is a 7. J is a 6, which is... And this one, I guess, because this part up here, maybe a little bit up here, it's got a little swirl there. But I think it looks cool. For half off, for $12 instead of $24, heck yeah. All day long. So there you are. A couple more I can put in my... I shouldn't put these on. I was just going to leave my new little $3 container that came from Hobby Lobby. And these is, are the new Hobby Lobby hooks with the squishy handles. And the tops up here are just like the material feels just like the larger clovers. Okay, let's see if our book's up by now. Well, of course not. We are 68% finished with the book. Okay, here we go. Hang on. I forgot what chapter this is. I think we're almost finished with it, but I just didn't have... I read for about 30 minutes, more or less. Chapter 9. So almost done with 9, and then I'll go ahead and start 10. If I don't read myself to sleep, I feel pretty with it right now. That don't always mean anything. Okie dokie. Alright, okay. Okay, the last thing... I'm going to go back and read like the last paragraph or so. So, you're not only suspecting women? Wait a minute. Let me go back. Sorry. I shook my head unbelievingly. Finding the cut book and little furs was bound, I knew, to direct attention to the owner of that house. But when I remembered Miss Emily coming in yesterday so bright and happy and excited, I think that's where I left off. Damn it all, excited. Yes, excited. Pink cheeks, shining eyes. Surely not because. I said thickly, this business is bad for one. One sees things, one imagines things. Yes, it isn't very pleasant to look upon the fellow creatures one meets as possible criminal lunatics. I got a little candy stuck up on the roof of my mouth, so it's a little bit of caramel. If my words sound a little queer, that might be why. He paused for a moment, then went on, "And there's Mr. Pye." I said sharply, "So you have considered him?" Nash smiled. "Oh, yes, we've considered him all right. A very curious character. Not, I should say, a very nice character. He's got no alibi. He was in his garden, alone, on both occasions. So you're not only suspecting women. I don't think a man wrote the letters. In fact, I'm sure of it, and so is Graves, always excepting our Mr. Pye, that is to say, who's got an abnormally female streak in his character. But we've checked up on everybody for yesterday afternoon. That's a murder case, you see. You're all right," he grinned. "And so's your sister, and Mr. Symington didn't leave his office after he got there, and Dr. Griffith was on a round in the other direction, and I've checked upon his visits." He paused, smiled again, and said, "You see, we are thorough." I said slowly, "So your case is eliminated down to those four, Miss Ginch, Mr. Pye, Miss Griffith, and little Miss Barton?" "Oh, no, we've got a couple more besides the vicar's lady." I thought about her. "You thought of her? We've thought of everybody, but Mrs. Dane Calthrop is a little too openly mad, if you know what I mean. Still, she could have done it. She was in a wood watching birds yesterday afternoon, and the birds can't speak for her." He turned sharply as Owen Griffith came into the police station. "Hello, Nash. I heard you around asking for me this morning. Anything important?" "Inquest on Friday, if that suits you, Dr. Griffith." "Right. Moresby and I are doing the PM tonight," Nash said. "There's just one other thing, Dr. Griffith. Mrs. Symington was taking some cachets, powders or something that you prescribed for her." He paused. Owen Griffith said interrogatively, "Yes." "Would an overdose of, I guess they're cachets, C-A-C-H-E-T-S, cachets have been fatal?" Griffith said dryly, "Certainly not. Not unless she'd taken about 25 of them." "But you once warned her about exceeding the dose, so Miss Holland tells me." "Oh, that, yes. Mrs. Symington was the sort of woman who would go and overdo anything she was given. Fancy that to take twice as much would do her twice as much good, and you don't want anyone to overdo even phenacetin or aspirin. Bad for their heart. And anyway, there's absolutely no doubt about the cause of death. It was cyanide." Miss Christie likes the cyanide, don't she? Doesn't she? "Oh, I know that. You don't get my meaning. I only thought that when committing suicide, you'd prefer to take an overdose of a soporific." "What?" "S-O-P-O-R-I-F-I-C. Soporific, rather than to feed yourself prussic acid." "Oh, quite. On the other hand, prussic acid is more dramatic and is pretty certain to do the trick. With barbiturates, for instance, you can bring the victim round if only a short time has elapsed." "I see. Thank you, Dr. Griffith." Griffith departed, and I said goodbye to Nash. I went slowly up the hill home. Joanna was out, at least there was no sign of her, and there was an enigmatical memorandum scribbled on the telephone block, presumably for the guidance of either Partridge or myself. "If Dr. Griffith rings up, I can't go on Tuesday, but could manage Wednesday or Thursday." I raised my eyebrows and went into the drawing room. I sat down in the most comfortable armchair. None of them were very comfortable. They tended to have straight backs and were reminiscent of the late Mrs. Barton. Stretched out my legs and tried to think the whole thing out. With sudden annoyance, I remembered that Owen's arrival had interrupted my conversation with the inspector and that he had just mentioned 2 other people as being possibilities. I wondered who they were. Partridge, perhaps, for one. After all, the cut book had been found in this house, and Agnes could have been struck down quite unsuspecting by her guide and mentor. No, you couldn't eliminate Partridge. But who was the other? Somebody perhaps that I didn't know? Mrs. Cleet, the original local suspect? I closed my eyes. I considered 4 people, strangely unlikely people in turn. Gentle, frail, little Emily Barton. What points were there actually against her? A starved life, dominated and repressed from early childhood. Too many sacrifices asked of her. Her curious horror of discussing anything not quite nice, that's in quotes, was that actually a sign of inner preoccupation with just these themes? Was I getting too horribly Freudian? I remembered a doctor once telling me that the mutterings of gentle maiden ladies when going off under an anesthetic were a revelation. You wouldn't think they knew such words. Amy Griffith? Surely nothing repressed or inhibited about her. Cheery, mannish, successful, a full busy life. Yet Mrs. Dane Calthrop had said, poor thing. And there was some remembrance. Oh, I'd got it. Owen Griffith saying something like, we had an outbreak of anonymous letters up north where I had a practice. Had that been Amy Griffith's work, too? Surely rather a coincidence. 2 outbreaks of the same thing. Stop a minute. They'd tracked down the author of those. Griffith had said so. A schoolgirl. Cold it was suddenly. Must be a draft from the window. I turned uncomfortably in my chair. Why did I suddenly feel so queer and upset? Go on thinking. Amy Griffith? Perhaps it was Amy Griffith, not that other girl. And Amy had come down here and started her tricks again. And that was why Owen Griffith was looking so unhappy and hag-ridden. He suspected, yes, he suspected. Mr. Pye? Not somehow a very nice little man. I could imagine him staging the whole business, laughing. That telephone message on the telephone pad in the hall, why did I keep thinking of it? Griffith and Joanna, he was falling for her. No, that wasn't why the message worried me. It was something else. My senses were swimming. Sleep was very near. I repeated idiotically to myself, no smoke without fire, no smoke without fire. That's it. It all links up together. And then I was walking down the street with Megan and Elsie Holland. With Megan, and Elsie Holland passed. She was dressed as a bride and people were murmuring, she's going to marry Dr. Griffith at last. Of course, they've been engaged secretly for years. There we were in the church, and Dane Calthrop was reading the service in Latin. And in the middle of it, Mrs. Dane Calthrop jumped up and cried energetically, it's got to be stopped. I tell you, it's got to be stopped. For a minute or two, I didn't know whether I was asleep or awake. Then my brain cleared and I realized I was in the drawing room of Little Furs and that Mrs. Dane Calthrop had just come through the window and was standing in front of me saying with nervous violence, "It's got to be stopped, I tell you." I jumped up. I said, "I beg your pardon? I'm afraid I was asleep. What did you say?" Mrs. Dane Calthrop beat one fist fiercely on the palm of her other hand. "It's got to be stopped. These letters. Murder. You can't go on having poor innocent children like Agnes Waddell killed." "You're quite right," I said, "but how do you propose to set about it?" Mrs. Dane Calthrop said, "We've got to do something." I smiled, perhaps in a rather superior fashion. "And what do you suggest that we should do?" "Get the whole thing cleared up. I said this wasn't a wicked place. I was wrong. It is." I felt annoyed. I said too politely, "Yes, my dear woman, but what are you going to do?" Mrs. Dane Calthrop said, "Put a stop to it, of course. The police are doing their best. If Agnes could be killed yesterday, their best isn't good enough. So you know better than they do?" "Not at all. I don't know anything at all. That's why I'm going to call in an expert." I shook my head. "You can't do that. Scotland Yard will only take over on demand from the chief constable of the county. Actually, they have sent Graves." "I don't mean that kind of an expert. I don't mean someone who knows about anonymous letters or even about murder. I mean someone who knows people. Don't you see? We want someone who knows a great deal about wickedness." It was a queer point of view, but it was somehow stimulating. Before I could say anything more, Mrs. Dane Calthrop nodded her head at me and said in a quick, confident tone, "I'm going to see about it right away." And she went out of the window again. And that's all of that chapter. What was that? 9? Okay. Yeah. So now we're on 10. 17 minutes. Maybe not quite, because I was talking about furrows at first. Okay, chapter 10, part 1. The next week, I think, was one of the queerest times I've ever passed through. It had an odd dream quality. Nothing seemed real. The inquest on Agnes Waddell was held, and the curious of Limstock attended en masse. No new facts came to light, and the only possible verdict was returned: murder by person or persons unknown. So poor little Agnes Waddell, having had her hour of limelight, was duly buried on the quiet old churchyard, and life in Limstock went on as before. No, that last statement is untrue. Not as before. There was a half-scared, half-avid gleam in almost everybody's eye. Neighbor looked at neighbor. One thing had been brought out clearly at the inquest. It was most unlikely that any stranger had killed Agnes. No tramps nor unknown men had been noticed or reported in the district. Somewhere then in Limstock, walking down the high street, shopping, passing the time of day, was a person who had cracked a defenseless girl's skull and driven a sharp skewer home to her brain. And no one knew who that person was. As I say, the days went by in a kind of dream. I looked at everyone I met in a new light, the light of a possible murderer. It was not an agreeable sensation. And in the evenings, with the curtain drawn, Joanne and I sit talking, arguing, going over in turn with all the various possibilities that still seemed so fantastic and incredible. Joanna held firm to her theory of Mr. Pye. I, after wavering a little, had gone back to my original suspect, Miss Ginch. But we went over the possible names again and again. Mr. Pye, Miss Ginch, Miss Dane Calthrop, Amy Griffith, Emily Barton, Partridge, and all the time nervously, apprehensively, we waited for something to happen, but nothing did happen. Nobody so far as we knew received any more letters. Nash made periodic appearances in the town, but what he was doing and what traps the police were setting, I had no idea. Graves had gone again. Emily Barton came to tea. Megan came to lunch. Owen Griffith went about his practice. We went with... Hang on. We went and drank... Megan came to lunch. Owen Griffith went about his practice. Okay. We went and drank sherry with Mr. Pye, and we went to tea at the vicarage. I was glad to find Mrs. Dane Calthrop displayed none of the militant ferocity she had shown on the occasion of our last meeting. I think she'd forgotten all about it. She seemed now principally concerned with the destruction of white butterflies so as to preserve cauliflower and cabbage plants. Our afternoon at the vicarage was really one of the most peaceful we had spent. It was an attractive old house and had a big, shabby, comfortable drawing room with faded rose cretonne or Cretonne. The Dane Calthrops had a guest staying with them, an amiable elderly lady who was knitting something with white fleecy wool. We had very good hot scones for tea. I'd love to have some scones. Some current ones. The vicar came in and beamed placidly on us whilst he pursued his gentle conversation. It was very pleasant. I don't mean that we got away from the topic of the murder because... Dang, my eyes are awful. Because we didn't. Miss Marple! Finally! Miss Marple, the guest, was naturally thrilled by the subject. As she said apologetically, we have so little time to talk about it in the country. She had made up her mind that the dead girl must have been just like her Edith. Such a nice little maid and so willing, but sometimes just a little slow to take in things. Miss Marple also had a cousin whose niece's sister-in-law had a great deal of annoyance and trouble over some anonymous letters. So the letters also were very interesting to the charming old lady. But tell me, dear, she said to Mrs. Dane Calthrop, what do the village people? The townspeople say, what did they think? Mrs. Cleet still, I suppose, said Joanna. Oh, no, said Mrs. Dane Calthrop, not now. Miss Marple asked who Mrs. Cleet was. Joanna said she was the village witch. That's right, isn't it, Mrs. Dane Calthrop? The vicar murmured a long Latin quotation about, I think, the evil power of witches, to which we all listened in respectful and uncomprehending silence. She's a very silly woman, said his wife. Likes to show off. Goes out to gather herbs and things at the full of the moon and takes care that everybody in the place knows about it. And silly girls go and consult her, I suppose, said Miss Marple. I saw the vicar getting ready to unload more Latin on us, and I asked hastily, but why shouldn't people suspect her of murder now? They thought she killed... Oh, Lord, y'all, I can't read much longer. My eyes are doing crazy things. Silly girls go around. I saw the vicar getting ready to unload, but why shouldn't people suspect her of murder now? They thought the letters were her doing? No, that's not a question. They thought the letters were her doing. Miss Marple said, oh, but the girl was killed with a skewer, so I hear. And then, parentheses, very unpleasant. Well, naturally, that takes all suspicion away from this Mrs. Cleet, because, you see, she could ill wish her so that the girl would waste away and die from natural causes. Strange how the old beliefs linger, said the vicar. In early Christian times, local superstition were wisely incorporated with Christian doctrines, and their more unpleasant attributes gradually eliminated. And I'm going to have to stop there, y'all. Sorry. Y'all have a happy Friday 13th evening. See you around the YT streets tomorrow and Sunday. 3 bells. Giveaway on Sunday at 3. Love ya. See you later. Did I say be sweet, don't be ugly? Probably. Bye.